In the beating heart of New Orleans, between the fleeting glow of saloon chandeliers and the constant smell of cheap alcohol, a woman lived in masks. Her name was Ruby, a strong name, bright as stone, but as false as the faded silk she pretended was satin. Ruby wasn't noble, she wasn't a lady, she was a saloon girl, someone accustomed to twirling among sweaty men and paid smiles, where every touch was a coin, every glance a risk. Yet Ruby kept a secret. Every night, after the piano fell silent and the glasses were empty, she would go up to the attic and read books on etiquette, romances of noble families, the mannerisms and gestures of someone who had never had to sell herself to survive. In her mind, Ruby wasn't just a saloon girl, she was a woman of rich birth, trapped in the wrong body and destiny. Everything changed on the night of the annual Grand Ball, an event that brought together Louisiana's elite, men and women who danced without breaking a sweat, who smiled without showing too much teeth, who spoke softly because they knew that those who shout never truly held power. Ruby knew she wasn't welcome there, but she also knew that no one knew all the faces of the nobility. She donned a stolen outfit, learned every curve of her posture, practiced her elegant accent, and pinned her hair up like she'd seen in French magazines. And so, she entered that ballroom as if she belonged, as if the blood in her veins were blue and not red from fighting. Her heart pounded, but her gaze was steady. She was, for that night, a lady, and no one would dare say otherwise. Share this story to reach further, subscribe to the channel, share this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll be very happy to read each comment. But fate, that ancient sculptor of irony, would place Ruby before a man who saw beyond the masks, a widowed cowboy with stormy eyes and hands calloused from hard work, who had more wounds in his soul than scars on his skin. He wasn't looking for a fake lady. He was looking, perhaps unknowingly, for someone who was real. And so begins this story, where a lie was the beginning of a truth no one expected. Follow me, because the first chapter of this dance has already begun. Ruby wasn't born to be a saloon girl. No one is. Life pushed her toward this destiny, like a flood pushes logs down a river. The daughter of an alcoholic butcher and a mother who couldn't survive the last winter, Ruby discovered early on that the world offered no tenderness to those who couldn't fight. At 16, she traded her shabby house on the outskirts of town for a job at the Red Lantern, a corner saloon with more broken promises than empty bottles. There, Ruby learned to smile without desire, to dance without soul, to offer herself without ever truly surrendering. It was survival, either that or hunger. And hunger she already knew all too well. However, unlike the other young women who worked there, Ruby had something no one saw, a gleam of restlessness in her eyes. When she wasn't in the salon, she hid among the books abandoned by the place's former owner, a bankrupt Frenchman who left behind volumes on nobility, history, and etiquette before fleeing his debts. Ruby read each page like someone drinking water after crossing the desert. She learned difficult words, refined gestures, the precise tilt of the head when greeting a gentleman. It was as if each book were a stepping stone toward a world that would never be hers, but which she could touch with her imagination. And it was this imagination that kept her alive for years, because every coin thrown at her feet, every unwanted hand touching her waist, was softened by the thought that she didn't belong there. She just was. In her mind, she was a fallen countess, a wronged lady, a woman meant to be admired, not possessed. This saved her from the clutches of despair. But her heart, strong as it was beginning to tire. The nights of off-key music and the smell of stale beer were no longer just work. They were a prison. Ruby knew no one would leave for her, that if she wanted to be someone else, she would need to clothe her lies with such truth that even she would believe it. And so, when she heard about the New Orleans Elite Grand Ball, she decided this was her chance. Not to run away, not to deceive, but to prove to herself that she could be more than what they said she was. With a stolen dress, a practiced posture, and a lie on her lips, she would enter where they swore she would never tread. She would be noble, even if only for one night. Even if her soul, deep down, still carried the weight of the red lantern. The night of the grand ball arrived like a celestial event for the city of New Orleans. The streets filled with gleaming carriages, gentlemen in impeccable tailcoats, and ladies whose dresses shimmered like constellations. The main ballroom of St. Martin's Palace was a living painting of luxury, with crystal chandeliers, gleaming marble floors, and the sound of a finely tuned orchestra that seemed to speak directly to the hearts of those listening. Ruby, however, hid her racing heart beneath layers of borrowed fabric. The dress she wore had been stolen from the trunk of a drunken lady who would never notice its absence. A dark blue gown, embroidered in silver, that transformed her, at least in the eyes of others, into someone she had never been. She knew every step would be a risk, that a closer look might unmask her, but Ruby moved like someone born for it. What she lacked in noble blood, she made up for with study, observation, and a confidence built through denial. As she entered the ballroom, the sweet scent of fresh flowers and the glitter of jewels almost intimidated her. But she took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and walked with the haughtiness of someone with a title hidden in their surname. Every man who watched her, every lady who frowned, they all believed she belonged there, because she believed it herself, if only for that night. And there was a plan: to seduce a gentleman, perhaps a wealthy landowner or a foolish heir who could open the doors to a life she could never achieve alone. Ruby didn't want love. Love was a luxury for those without hunger. She wanted security, respect, a surname that would wash away the burden of being just the Red Lantern Girl. And so she danced, laughed delicately, offered calculated glances. Every gesture was a piece in the game, every word a lure. But her heart, that incorrigible traitor, beat differently every time her eyes met those of a man who didn't fit in. A man in worn boots and a battered hat, the only one not dressed in the expensive robes of the elite, but who carried a presence that silenced everyone. He didn't belong in that world, just like she did, and maybe that's why Ruby couldn't ignore him. His name was Elijah Turner, a widowed Texas cowboy, a man of few words. He was only there because his brother, an influential senator, had insisted he needed to socialize after years of seclusion and mourning. Elijah didn't know how to dance, didn't know how to compliment without sounding rude, and didn't know how to pretend to be impressed by the frivolities of that elite who spoke of gold and land as if they were all there was in the world. But when he looked at Ruby, something disconcerted him. She smiled like the others, spoke with the ease of trained ladies, but her eyes said something else. There was a gleam there, of someone familiar with the dust, the struggle, the hard ground of life. Elijah recognized that look because it was the same one he saw in the mirror every morning. As Ruby floated between pairs, trying to pinpoint a target for her plan, Elijah remained on the sidelines, watching like a hunter waiting for the right moment. When he finally approached, it was without pomp, without reverence, without the mask the other men insisted on wearing. "You dance like someone who's danced on worn wood floors, not this polished marble," he said, his voice hoarse, like dust on his words. Ruby froze for a moment. No one had ever told her so precisely what she truly was, but she smiled, her mask firm, and replied, "And you look like someone who's already lost so much, perhaps even more than hope." The answer surprised him. It wasn't what he'd expected from a noble lady, and in that moment they saw each other behind the masks. The dance that began between them was slow, careful. Ruby, accustomed to seducing foolish men, found herself intrigued by someone who couldn't be deceived. Elijah, accustomed to solitude, found himself drawn to a woman who hid as much as he did. She pretended to be noble. He pretended he didn't need anyone. And amidst this silent clash, a truth began to insinuate itself. Perhaps they weren't so different. Perhaps behind all the deception, there were two hearts that only wanted to belong. That night, Elijah didn't promise anything. He just offered a look that said, "I know who you are, even if you deny it." And Ruby, for the first time, felt fear, not of what he was discovering, but of what he might awaken. After the ball, Ruby couldn't forget Elijah's gaze. It wasn't a look of desire or simple curiosity. It was a look that pierced through her makeup, her stolen dress, and her practiced accent. It was as if he saw not just the woman she pretended to be, but the woman she truly was. A saloon girl, her feet scarred by the dirty wood and her heart hardened by need, and that disconcerted her more than anything else. Ruby tried to convince herself he was just another man, another look among many. But the truth, painful and insistent, was that he had recognized her, not for who she pretended to be, but for what her silence screamed. Still, the game had to go on. She had decided she would have a better life, no matter what. And whether Elijah was an obstacle or a path, she still didn't know. The days that followed brought chance encounters between the two. Chance, or fate as some would say, brought them face to face on market corners, in busy squares, or even at the Red Lantern, where Ruby returned every night, exchanging her lady's dress for her usual tight corset. Elijah appeared there not as a customer, but as a curious observer, always leaning against the counter, drinking little and speaking less. He looked at her shamelessly, without a mask, and each time Ruby crossed the room and her eyes met his, she felt a sense of unease, a reminder that her pretense was merely a thin layer about to shatter. And each time he approached, even without saying much, it was as if he were baring his soul in the middle of the room, in front of everyone. Ruby maintained her role as a proud and refined woman outside the Red Lantern, feigning indifference when she encountered him in the city. She called herself a lady to her acquaintances, lying about a European surname and a fictitious fortune stashed in invisible vaults. Each word was a brick building a house of cards, fragile but beautiful to behold. Elijah, however, never directly challenged her lies. He simply listened with that steady, compassionate gaze, as if waiting for the right moment to speak the truth they both knew. And this angered Ruby more than if he had accused her of deception. Because deep down, she knew he knew, and his silence was the most painful condemnation. At each meeting, the game of appearances continued. She told stories of a life she never had, of parties in Europe, of dresses from Paris. Elijah listened without interrupting, sometimes smirking, sometimes just watching, but always with that look that said, "I know it's not true." And Ruby increasingly lost herself between the lie she needed to maintain and the growing desire to be herself in front of him. But pride, that heavy anchor, held her back. If she revealed who she was, he would despise her like everyone else. Because in the end, who would love a saloon girl pretending to be noble? And so the game continued, night after night, date after date. But Ruby's heart could no longer tell where the lie ended, and the desire to truly be someone worthy of that gaze began. Elijah didn't ask for the truth, but the silence between them demanded it. The nights grew heavier for Ruby. Each time she returned to her room at the Red Lantern, where the rotting wood reeked of loneliness, she sat before the cracked mirror and stared angrily at her reflection. She saw there not the lady she pretended to be, but the weary, hollow-eyed woman who only wanted to be enough. The weight of the lie was a burden that bent her shoulders, and each night it seemed harder to maintain the role. And worse, it wasn't just the fear of being unmasked. It was the fear of losing the only gaze that saw her beyond the makeup. Elijah made no promises, no sweet words, but his constant presence, his way of listening to her even when she lied. All of this was like an invitation for her to finally shed the pretense. But how could she tell the truth to a man who seemed so different? Ruby knew Elijah was a widower, that he had loved a real woman, a wife with a whole soul. What would he see in her when he discovered the ballroom lady was actually the saloon girl everyone knew by her first name and her curves? The fear of rejection was greater than the weight of the lie itself. Still, the truth suffocated her like a scarf tied around her throat. She wanted to speak, wanted to scream, wanted to say she wasn't who she pretended to be, but she didn't know how. The weight of this secret began to transform her. Her practiced smile lost its luster. Her haughty gaze wavered. Even the dances at the Red Lantern became slower, less seductive, as if her tired body could no longer maintain the mask. The other girls noticed, whispered, mocked. "Has the nobility tired of pretending, Ruby?" they said, laughing. And she just smiled back, a dead smile, because she knew it was no longer a joke. Elijah continued to appear, always at the back of the room, always waiting for the moment when she would have the courage to be her true self. One such night, unable to bear the weight, Ruby approached him, her eyes brimming with tears that refused to fall. "Why do you keep coming here, Elijah? What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice cracking. He looked at her calmly and replied, "I want what you keep inside, not what you wear on the outside." And then Ruby understood. He didn't need her to confess. He already knew, and yet it was still there. The weight of the truth still rested on her shoulders, but for the first time, she felt like maybe she didn't have to carry it alone. Ruby's world of lies couldn't last forever. And like every poorly kept secret, hers came crashing down in the cruelest and most public way. It was a sultry afternoon in New Orleans when Elijah's brother, Senator Robert Turner, crossed paths with Ruby downtown. He recognized her immediately, not as the ballroom lady, but as the Red Lantern girl, famous among the businessmen and politicians who visited the saloon in search of a quick date. Surprise turned to derision, and within a day, the news spread like wildfire. The beautiful lady who had paraded at the grand ball, who had captivated the eyes of so many influential men, was nothing more than a saloon woman, a cheap pretender. And like every rumor in a small, proud town, the news was distorted, exaggerated, and spewed by mouths thirsty for destruction. When Ruby found out, her feet sank. The Red Lantern was no longer a haven, and the streets became trails of leering looks and muffled laughter. Men who had once thrown coins at her now spat as they passed. Women, once indifferent, now looked at her with contempt, as if confirming an old judgment. A saloon woman can never be noble, not for a night, not even for pretense. But nothing pained Ruby more than imagining what Elijah would think. She avoided him for days, weeks, locking herself in the saloon's dark room, dreading the moment when he too would point the finger or worse, simply never show up again. But Elijah wasn't like the others. One night, he walked into the Red Lantern, his hat pulled tight on his head, his gaze steady, searching the shadows for her. When he finally found her, Ruby was huddled behind the counter, her face drawn, her eyes vacant. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice heavy, not with contempt but with disappointment. "Is that what you've been hiding from me all this time?" Ruby looked up with difficulty. Tears wanted to fall, but her pride stubbornly held them back. "I didn't want to lie to you. I just wanted to be someone you could look at without shame," she confessed, her voice breaking, each word like a knife to her throat. Elijah took a deep breath, his gaze filled with a feeling Ruby couldn't name. It wasn't anger, it wasn't pity, it was sadness. "Do you really think I cared about the dress, the title, the made-up name?" he said, his tone a mix of pity and sincerity. "I only wanted you, Ruby, but now even you don't seem to know who you are." Those words were the final blow. Ruby felt her body weaken, her chest tighten. He turned and left, leaving behind a trail of dust, a void so great that not even the entire saloon could fill it. The contempt she so feared didn't come from others, it came from herself, because in that moment Ruby knew she had lost more than a lie. She had lost the only person who saw her beyond herself. Ruby spent sleepless nights. The Red Lantern was now a dark prison, a constant mirror of the failure she had always tried to deny. It wasn't just the sham shattered, it was her heart that had broken in half, because even surrounded by men every day, she had never felt so alone. Elijah's words echoed in her mind. "I only wanted you, Ruby," and she no longer knew who that you was. The face in the mirror was a mixture of smeared makeup, puffy eyes, and exhaustion. The noble woman she had tried to embody had died before she was even born. Only the girl from the saloon remained, but who was this real girl? It was one silent morning that Ruby decided she needed to change. She couldn't continue being a ghost of what she'd pretended to be. So with what little she had, she left the saloon without telling anyone. She left behind the smell of alcohol, the fake laughter, the consuming looks. She hit the road, barefoot, her soul lighter, even though she carried the shame. She walked to Elijah's small farm in Texas, a place she'd heard about through his conversations, through the dreams he'd unknowingly shared. It was far away, and every step was a confrontation with herself. But Ruby knew she could no longer live without staring at her own unmasked reflection. When she arrived, covered in dust, her clothes simple and her hair disheveled, Elijah was in the field, feeding the horses. He saw her, but didn't say anything immediately. He just watched her, as if unsure if this was real or just another illusion. Ruby approached, her heart pounding in her chest, and spoke in a firm voice, even though she trembled inside. "I'm not noble. I never was. I'm just Ruby, the girl who dances because she knows nothing else, the woman who lied because she thought no one would love her if they knew who she was. But I'm here because I don't want to lie anymore, because if I have to be loved, let it be for who I truly am." Elijah set aside the bucket and walked toward her. His face was serious, but his eyes held a sparkle Ruby hadn't seen since the ball. Without saying a word, he pulled her into a hug. Strong, warm, real. A hug that said it all, that he accepted her, that she no longer needed to pretend. "I don't want nobility, Ruby. I want you. With every lie you've told, with every truth, you now have the courage to speak." She cried, and each tear was a part of the weight she was finally leaving behind. There, in that dusty field, she found what she'd always sought, a place to exist without having to lie. A love that gave her not the life she'd pretended to have, but the one she truly deserved. From that embrace on, Ruby began to live the life she'd always dreamed of, not because she became noble, but because she was finally accepted as she was. Elijah didn't have mansions or royal blood, but he had land he cultivated with dignity, a heart that knew how to hear the silence of others, and a soul that, though marked by grief, still knew how to love. Ruby found a home on that farm she'd never imagined. She no longer needed to paint herself with titles or adorn her face with fake smiles. There, she could laugh loudly, sing off-key, learn to farm, care for horses. She could exist without fear of discovery because there was no longer any lie to cover up. Elijah treated her with the delicacy a gardener treats the flower he's chosen to care for. He didn't rescue her. Ruby rescued herself by having the courage to be true, and he was the solid ground where she could finally put down roots. Little by little, Ruby discovered that what made someone noble wasn't blood, but character. And Elijah had that in spades. He taught her to trust, to slow down, to feel the wind in her hair without the need for a salon or ball gowns. Every sunset on the farmhouse porch was a reminder that she no longer needed to run from herself. She was Ruby, and that was enough. Nights that were once filled with the sound of an out-of-tune piano at the Red Lantern were now lulled by the sound of crickets, the smell of fresh coffee, and the warmth of sincere love. Ruby and Elijah, two hearts scarred by the past, found a future together that needed no disguise. She was no parlor lady, but the queen of that piece of land and of that heart that refused to die after the widow he loved so much. And he was no prince, but he was the man who gave her a life she only dared imagine before falling asleep. Ruby never wanted to be anyone else again. She didn't need to be, because now she was true, and that was enough to live and be happy. This isn't just the story of Ruby, the saloon girl who pretended to be noble. This is the story of everyone who has ever looked in the mirror and disliked what they saw, of everyone who, at some point, felt they needed to be someone else, to be worthy of love, respect, or a place in the world. How many times in your life have you felt like being yourself wasn't enough? How many times have you hidden behind a rehearsed smile, an outfit that didn't really fit, words that didn't reflect who you were inside? Ruby is us, each of us, pretending to the world because we're afraid our truth is too heavy for anyone to carry. And in the midst of it all, someone like Elijah appears. Not a prince, not a savior, but a scarred, wounded man who has also lost so much that he has learned to see beyond the masks. Elijah didn't need a title or beauty to recognize Ruby's soul. He didn't want her perfect. He wanted the truth. He wanted what remained when all the paintings, the embellishments, the rehearsed words fell away. And this is one of the greatest lessons of this story. True love doesn't require us to lie. True love doesn't ask us to be prettier, smarter, richer. It just asks us to be real, and as difficult as it may be, this is the only way to be truly loved. Think about it. What's the point of pretending to be someone you're not, if in the end, the one who loves you is loving a lie? And the longer you spend playing a role, the more you lose yourself, to the point where you don't even know who you are anymore. But when you have the courage to strip away the lies, to face your own reflection with all its flaws, all its pain, all the history the world tries to hide, that's when the chance for a new beginning arises. Because someone, somewhere, is waiting not for your mask, but for your essence. If this story touched you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with a friend who's always pretending to be strong, or with someone who hides who they are for fear of not being accepted. Share it on WhatsApp, Facebook, or comment below where you're listening. I really want to know how far this story has reached and who it has reached. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, leave your like, because only then can I continue bringing these stories that are not just tales of the Wild West, but reflections of the life we all live in one way or another. And finally, never forget, it's better to be loved for who you are, flaws and all, than to be admired for a persona you can no longer maintain. The truth may hurt at first, but it's the truth that builds the love that lasts. Thank you for listening, for feeling, for letting this story enter your heart. Until the next video, where the stories continue to remind us that even amidst dust, pain and lies, a love that saves and liberates can always blossom.